Hey, Michael.
Hey, David, how you doing?
Good. Yourself?
Real good, thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, and thanks to JFF for having both of us today. I want to hear your reactions to what you heard from Dan. But first, I want to step back and really assess the big picture with you. And it's been quite a year. You know, many of us are still sort of trapped at home. And as we've been here, a pandemic has unfolded. There was a national conversation about racism that went right up into the boardrooms of many of the largest companies in the country. And in the last several months, many CEOs found themselves in the uncomfortable position of weighing in on the peaceful transfer of power, the democratic process. And in the midst of all this, it certainly seemed like maybe this was an inflection point. Maybe this was a moment where companies and CEOs were embracing their role in a different way, and maybe even starting to treat their employees in a different way. But you and I have both been doing this long enough to know that there's good reason to be skeptical about a lot of this. So I just want your big picture takeaway. Are we right now at a real moment of potential transformation about how corporate America is dealing with society, with all stakeholders? Or is there a real risk here that so much of this is still greenwashing and that before long we'll be back to the status quo?
Yeah, I would say, David, that of all companies, for about 1% of them, really using the triggering point, George Floyd's murder, for 1% of all companies, things are different. And I think great companies that I tend to deal with that are really focused on what's going on with their employees, you know, companies like a PayPal, I'd say about 10% of them. That something happened as a result of the combination of COVID plus George Floyd's murder and the murder of other unarmed Black people and the politics. Those companies are different. Something happened within those leaders, and those companies are different. So I'm inspired by the 1% or the 10% of the great companies, but recognizing the reality, we have a long way to go for the 99% or the 90% of the remaining companies.
Yeah. Well, let's, if you would, break it down into sort of the component parts of those three big things that many companies have had to deal with over the last year. And I wonder if we could start with the pandemic. And listen, of course, there's been real carnage to the economy over the last year, and unemployment is often presented as a statistic, but it's, of course, millions and millions of individual stories. And I wonder if you could step back and help us understand which companies in your mind, and what sort of companies, and what kind of responses from companies have really set the bar quite high, which companies have gotten it right, what kind of things have been the right things for employers to do over this last year, and conversely, where have people gotten it wrong? What's been the wrong way for companies to respond to their employee base at a time of such tremendous need?
I think companies that decided, you know, at some point, let's say March, April, May of 2020, that it's time to take care of their employees, they were already getting it wrong, and they continued to get it wrong. So if you didn't, you know, believe in caring for your employees, trusting your employees, which is what distributed work required, making sure your employees were safe, those that were still out going to work, not everybody worked from home. Then 2020 was a tough year, because when you suddenly started to act like you cared, it felt like you cared just because of the economics that you needed, but you really didn't care from. And so what we saw, we surveyed 10,000 companies a year, is trust deteriorated in companies where it was already weak. The opposite also happened, as Dan mentioned, that companies that were doing great work, 2018, 2019, their scores went up dramatically, like at no time before. We're talking about 10 percentage point leaps in the experience of the employee, because work meant a lot more to people in 2020. Everything else was so unreliable and unstable and uncertain in everyone's lives. The one thing they leaned on and sometimes ran to and escaped to was work. And so that connection to work, to their employer, and realizing how important their employer was and the people that they were working with, it became more important. So companies were rewarded in 2020 that were already doing this work in terms of taking care of their people, communicating with their people. Employees don't really care who their leader votes for. Employees care what their leader believes in. So those companies who were clear about communicating through 2020 some of the crazy things that were happening, the companies just got stronger. The employee scores went up, and so did the customer net promoter scores, as Dan mentioned.
That's all very helpful. In all my conversations with CEOs over the last year, the word all of them used was over communication. They all just felt like if they spent an hour a week trying to communicate with their team, now it was up to 5 hours a week or more.
Sure.
How about this second thing I mentioned, which was, of course, at its most intense over the previous summer, but of course has been with us for generations and will likely be with us for many years longer, which is this national reckoning with a history of racism. And that, of course, permeated many companies as well. Can you talk to us about which companies or how companies could do this in an authentic way that went beyond just making a financial commitment or writing a check, but went into the real DNA of how a company was operating in the communities and with its own employees? What's the right way for companies to be approaching this most difficult of issues?
Okay, so I'll talk about, not the performative things, but where companies are actually doing things structurally that I think are going to lead to change. Companies that are doing things structurally know that they've got a lot of hard work to do, probably the hardest work that they have to do, maybe that they've ever had to do as leaders in terms of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, in an organization. So they're good at many things. This they're not good at, and they haven't been good at it. So it's a new challenge. There's no vaccine for this. There's a vaccine that we have now. There's no vaccine for this. In 400 years, we don't have a vaccine for this. So you don't even have that hope. We all have a hope that, wow, we have this COVID experience. Now there's a vaccine, and then we're going to move. This one isn't like that. It's far more difficult than that. So what organizations are doing is, number one, they're setting goals, measurable goals around what they're going to do to make sure their organization looks different, feels different, and is different at some point in the future. Companies that are saying 2030, that there's a signal there. Companies that are saying 2024, that's reality. That if a company commits 2024, their organization should look different, feel different, and be different. And what I mean by that is they can talk about if they've got 10,000 employees now of different demographic groups, they should be able to go to the future and say, I think we're going to have 13,000, and here's where we're going to be with these different demographic groups. So the idea of targets and things that you can measure, we measure everything else, we have to measure this too. And then, so that's number one on the diversity front, making sure that, as we say, a great place to work for all has to be present. So this is the recruiting, this is the pipeline, and holding leaders accountable for being able to open their minds and define talent clearly, get rid of biases, which takes training and work, but more than anything else, a message from the CEO that, let me tell you, we've got 3% African Americans in our company now. In 3 years, we want to be at 5 or 6%, period. And then dealing with the inevitable backlash that starts immediately, which is, we're going to drop the quality of our talent now just because of some, diversity goal, which is what a CEO has to deal with head on as to why this isn't about a quota and dropping quality. We understand why you might think that based on your lived experience, but this is about the best talent, because to achieve our purpose, like Dan talked about, a huge purpose beyond just shareholder returns, we're doing, most companies are recruiting from these people, kind of in this narrow aperture, same places, same schools, look the same way, and it's comfortable. They're leaving everybody else out of the picture. And if anybody thinks that all the best talent is in this narrow aperture, it's just only racism makes you think that. Statistically, it cannot be true unless you have some beliefs in your head that this group is superior and the rest of the group is inferior. Well, if you aren't a racist and so you instead see people as people, then you know there's a lot of talent out there. A lot of talent out there. And why not go get that talent and get the competitive advantage while other firms are kind of still hung up? So they are taking teams of people, their best people, they're taking them out of their roles and putting them on this problem, just like they did for COVID. They took people out of the best people they had and put them on a COVID task force and started to work on people with parental responsibilities, people with elder care. How do we do software testing in this new distributed mode? How do we do the persona development in marketing? The best people were assigned on this COVID thing. The best companies are doing the exact same thing around diversity. And because that's number one. And then you continue to do that work around the experience that people are going to have to make sure that people have upward mobility. It's one thing to give $10 million to historically black colleges. Love that idea. But what people really want is the people who are already in companies who went to historically black colleges getting an opportunity to get promoted.
And this is something we talked about in a separate conversation yesterday, was the way in which diversity democratizes wealth, and giving these opportunities to a truly diverse talent pool in the long run truly does change the complexion and the distribution of real wealth in our society. And that, I certainly believe, has a whole series of positive knock-on effects.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, I know that's what JFF believes in. We believe in it too. But this is one of those strange areas where people have all that data and knowledge and know-how, and they aren't doing anything. I think for Dan, we need 3,000 Dans. Yeah. As far as I'm concerned. So all about that, all about what he's doing. I think his mother, I applaud her. I know she took him as a young child, to hear Martin Luther King's speech, in 1963. So there was a seed that was planted in him. And then I think that he woke up, frankly. He woke up. Now, because we have a lived experience, I wouldn't have needed to survey my employees to know that people making a minimum wage were suffering. But for his experience, that was, eye-opening for him. And by the way, there's no place in the United States where minimum wage is a fair wage. There isn't a place in the United States. It doesn't really work anywhere. But this is just the lived experience difference. But I applaud everything that he's doing, and I wish we had 3,000 more leaders like him.
Michael, talk to us about where those moments can come from. How do CEOs and other C-level leaders wake up? Because you've got an audience here of people who I think are very interested in engineering those kind of moments for the people who can really make a difference.
Yeah.
So what are some effective ways? What are the right conversations, the right experiences people need to be having to have that kind of insight, that spark that gives them the perspective to recognize that it's time to take action?
Yeah, that one, I've been trying to figure that out since I was 10 years old, and so I thought that, okay, being, really smart and being this and that, all that stuff failed me. So I don't know what to say on that. Still, people treated me differently, regardless of everything I tried to do, the schools I went to and so on. So I don't really have an answer there. But what I've observed is the following. Since we're talking about men primarily, when they have a daughter, their view changes on pay equity. That I've seen. Like, I can't even believe it. All of a sudden, and I'm like, what happened to you? Well, my daughter. And I'm like, oh, okay. Or a daughter-in-law. Okay, so there are things that happen, or having a kid with autism. All of a sudden, they're all into autism, or the parental benefits. Oh, now, once they have kids, then they up the parental benefits. So that self-experience thing, not only self-interest, changes people, because now the empathy is real. Yeah. It isn't borderline sympathy. It's, I actually get that, and I want to make things better for those people because I've experienced something like that. A person whose daughter adopts an African-American child and the family's not African-American, all of a sudden, things are different and they see things differently. So Those are the human experiences that happen. And so I think for some people, something happens. Something happens, bang, and then they change. And the transformation begins, and we have a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly. I've seen that. So what do we do? Does everybody have to have daughters, or adopt black people? If so, we got a long way to go. I think it's by, which Dan talked about, talking to people and listening carefully that have had different lived experiences than you. And you got to do the work. Yeah, you got to read the books. Yeah, you got to read White Fragility. Yeah, you got to read How to Be an Anti-Racist. But you got to do more than that. You got to talk to people that can talk to you in a way that you feel something about their experience that makes you want to improve things for them, which is the empathy that matters, that you want to take action now. So you see that you got a tech company and 3% black people, it doesn't make sense. Right. It doesn't make sense. There's no way you can't tell me why it makes sense. Every tech company has salespeople who don't have PhDs in nuclear physics. They have art degrees and history degrees. So there's no way that you can tell me that that something else isn't going on here. But the leader has to be purpose driven, want to do something about it, and then actually lean in to start to make a difference.
And then even a lot of companies, if they have a leader who has that spark, wants to start doing programs like this, there's still this myth, and I know it's pervasive in the boardroom, that, well, it's going to cost a lot of money and it might not show up in the bottom line right away. And so there's this cascading series of excuses that companies and boards and shareholders come up with when they're talking themselves out of taking better care of their employees broadly. And I wonder, you have the data, Michael. What does the data tell us about what happens inside companies, not only to what Dan said about Net Promoter Score and employee morale, but about to the real results, financial results of companies when they start to step up and take real excellent care of their employees? You have the data. What does it say?
The data says that the employee experience improves, and these companies outperform the Russell 2000, Russell 3000, and the S&P 500 almost 3-1. So these companies make more money, and yes, their net promoter scores are higher. So this is a way to win in business. That data's in. You can go to our website, look at our book. A lot of people write about this topic. There's a reason PayPal's performing the way that it's performing. Mm-hmm. So we have the data on that. Why is it that people in this area all of a sudden need data? People can decide we're going to go to China and we're going to do work in China. We're going to outsource now, and they do the analysis, and sometimes they don't do the analysis. They just take the action. Only in diversity, equity, inclusion do people need hundreds of business cases. This is the only one. And in terms of being a great place to work and having money, we have investment banks that we survey that people are making, tons of people making multi-millions of dollars, and they say the place is a horrible place to work. Horrible place to work with gold-plated benefits. So the correlation between pay and gold-plated benefits and being a great place to work where you feel respected and cared for, and that the organization needs you and you're part of a team and you're all winners. It's not a winners and losers type culture. The pay and the benefits don't matter. At the other end, we have companies we survey. You would say, God, those are horrible benefits. And that pay isn't very good. And people say it's a great place to work. And when you look at the data, it's because of how they're treated by the people that they work for.
Yeah. And finally, Michael, in closing, this has been great, full of terrific and actionable insights. I wonder, could you just talk about something that Dan said? I thought it was a very compelling line, and I don't know the degree to which you would hear a lot of other CEOs say it. So I'd love your thoughts on both the content and how pervasive this worldview may or may not be in all the companies you work with. And it's what Dan said about employees. He said employees are the number one constituency of stakeholders that a company needs to pay attention to. How does that sentiment square with all the work you're doing?
We agree with it 100%. We understand that, especially those that are publicly traded companies, for some reason, that CEO usually is afraid to say it. That CEO, and I'd say to CEOs, look, if you're afraid to say it, don't say it. Go ahead and say customer first. customer first. But when you're inside the company, you better say, look, let me tell you why I say that to the street. Okay, because they only like to hear that, because they only see that as a driver for earnings. But here in the family, I'm letting you know, I get that by taking care of you and taking care of your family, that's how we're going to take care of that customer. So it's just our family secret here. But when I'm out there, I'm going to be talking customer, customer, customer. Well, there are a few purpose-driven people who, like an Anil Boosri, is like, look, I haven't found a company that has happy customers and unhappy employees. Mm-hmm. It doesn't last long, but he knows all about the opposite because he's created it. So right. Some are just fearful of being themselves and stating what they believe in. But even if you are fearful on the inside, you got to make sure your people know what makes basic sense. I mean, how could it not be true that if you take care of your employees, they're going to do a much better job of taking care of each other and your customers and the community that they live in?
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Michael, it was such a pleasure to talk with you as always. Thank you so much for being with us today.